The DFT really appreciates the involvement of the maritime community and apologises for not appreciating the impact of the directive upon us. The DFT is doing its best to ensure the impact is as small as possible within the overall good which comes from reducing atmospheric pollution, which is the main driver for the directive. But my own experience, I was previously at the MCA and involved in EU directives. Once they are agreed, the member states have little alternative but to implement them. And unlike some, the UK, once it implements a directive, also ensures it complies with the directive. If only we could be like the French, although not at the moment. Okay, I'm going to start my presentation. This is about the directive, and it sets harmonised standards for the quality of fuel across the EU. I'm not going to read this verbatim, but you'll notice the use of the acronym NRMM. And the purpose of the directive is to control air pollution both directly and by enabling the introduction of emissions control technology to new engines and vehicles. Now, the gas oil requirements are currently 1,000 milligrams per kilogram, which is 0.1%. And sulfur has a benefit to engines in those concentrations. Now, the directive was developed in the following way. It's a requirement to reduce life cycle greenhouse gas emissions in road fuel. It's also got requirements about petrol and tighter diesel specifications. Now, the intention was the 300 milligrams per kilogram sulfur content for gas oil on inland waterways, vessels and recreational craft from the 1st of January this year until the end of next year. That was the intention. And a 10 milligram per kilogram sulfur content limited for NRMM gas oil from the 1st of January 2010, and for inland waterway vessels from the 1st of January 2012. That was the intention. Now, during the EU negotiations and adoption, the proposal was subject to negotiations in the European Parliament and the Council of European Environment Ministers during 2007 and 2008. And the European Parliament, and sometimes you hear about the EU, there's this democratic deficit, and it's all done by bureaucrats. But in this case, it was the European Parliament, supported by several member states, proposed aligning inland waterways sulfur consistent content requirements with those for other NRMM. And that probably seemed, from a bureaucratic point of view, a good idea. However, as we're going to discover, it's got severe implications for this industry. And the proposal was adopted on the 23rd of April 2009 and published as a directive 2009-30 EC. And once a directive is published, the juggernaut rolls. And if a member state doesn't implement it, then there are swinging fines for the government department. It can result in millions of pounds fines per day. Okay, the scope. Fuels intended for NRMM, including inland waterway vessels when not at sea, and recreational craft when not at sea. There's a definition of gas oils, and from the 1st of January 2011, the thing that's caused all the surprise, gas oil for use in inland waterway vessels and recreational craft must not exceed 10 milligrams per kilogram sulfur content, which is essentially sulfur-free. And member states, including this one, are obliged to implement in national law by the 31st of December. So it's got to be in law, and then those nice people from Brussels will come and make sure it's being implemented. So the DFT plans to implement these requirements by amending the above regulations. And the consultation draft regulations make it an offence for fuel suppliers to supply fuel for use in inland waterway vessels when not at sea, or recreational craft if the fuel does not comply with the sulfur content limits. So the hand of regulation will be upon the fuel suppliers. And some oil companies have indicated they intend to comply by supplying road diesel marked with, or red diesel. Others have indicated they expect to comply by supplying a dedicated sulfur-free gas oil grade. And one problem of this is that because the market for inland waterway vessels is quite small, there are no economies of scale. And I've heard before this, I started this presentation that if only the railway industry were required to comply as well, then it would make fuel supplies much more economic for the operators. DFT is gathering information from individual companies on their plans in order to inform inland waterway stakeholders. And it said that dedicated sulfur-free gas oil is not expected to pose significant issues for inland waterway users. Potentially in some older vessels, seals in fuel pumps which have not been rebuilt within the last 10 years may need replacing. It's not expected to affect a significant proportion of vessels. However, it's recommended you start checking for signs of leakage, and if leakage occurs, replace seals. That's probably news to you operators. I think that's probably telling grandmother to take eggs. Now, the impacts on fuel storage and use for road diesel, it requires very careful handling. It contains up to 7% biodiesel. And although improving as fuel suppliers gain experience, biodiesel blends have poorer long-term stability than fossil diesel. And there's a recommended turnover rate. Biodiesel blends are at higher risk of bacterial growth in the presence of water, which is hard to exclude from marine applications. And water should be removed from fuel storage tanks. Biodiesel may loosen deposits, and it's recommended a one-off replacement of fuel filters is recommended after every 2 or 3 tankfuls. Now, the draft consultation regulations have already had certain things flagged up. Erroneously, they do not exclude fuel used by recreational craft when at sea from the sulfur-free requirements. So when recreational craft are used at sea, they have to have sulfur-free fuel. They do not explicitly define the geographic scope of the requirements, i.e. what constitutes operation at sea. And they do not exclude inland waterway vessels with national seagoing certification from the requirements. And the DFT is looking at how to address these points in the final regulations. Oops. Inland waterway, these are the vessels covered by the directive. Inland waterway vessels of 20 meters or more length and 100 cubic meters or more volume, or tugs and pusher craft for the above. It excludes passenger vessels intended for 12 or fewer passengers, seagoing vessels operating temporarily on inland waterways, provided they carry a SOLAS, load line or equivalent certificate. And recreational craft, any craft of any type intended for sports or leisure purposes and between 2.5 and 24 meters in hull length. So inland waterway vessels, recreational craft are covered by the directive. We come into the issue of when not at sea, because people are working very hard to try and find some way to give a bit of implementation time for the industry. And the directive only covers fuel used by inland waterway vessels and recreational craft when not at sea. But the directive doesn't define sea, and DFT are looking at options for how to define the scope of the requirements in the UK regulations. And there are a number of regulations which define categorised waters. There's the merchant shipping prevention of air pollution from ships regulations, and also by reference to non-tidal waters, or possibly leaving at sea undefined and rely on guidance in merchant shipping notices. So the Department for Transport is looking at how to accommodate that. That's the end of my presentation. Further information is available from your fuel supplier or the DFT's website.